right now, as you listen to this, there is like a 99% chance that a completely synthetic chemical is currently circulating through your bloodstream.
Yeah, 99%.
And it's one specifically engineered in a laboratory to, never break down in nature. And the wildest part of this, you didn't inhale it at some toxic industrial site or something.
No, definitely not.
You most likely put it there during your lunch break completely by accident while eating something you thought was totally normal.
It is a staggering statistic, honestly. To be precise, the latest biomonitoring data
Yeah.
from NAAs, that's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, places the detection rate of these persistent chemicals at 98 to 99% of the general United States population.
Which is just, it's everyone.
Right. We are essentially looking at a universal baseline of exposure. It's no longer an anomaly, It is an ambient condition of modern life.
And that ambient condition is exactly what we are exploring today. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission for this session isn't to give you standard, run-of-the-mill health advice. We are going to sit here and debate macronutrients in a vacuum or tell you to eat more spinach.
Yeah, that's not what this is about.
Right. Instead, we are launching an investigation into the hidden architecture of modern survival. We're going to map out a massive, entirely invisible system that directly impacts your daily life, your cellular biology, and honestly, even your core concept of free will.
Which I realize sounds like a massive, almost philosophical claim.
It does.
But the data we are bringing to the table today leaves very little room for interpretation. We have a formidable stack of recent, highly consequential sources in front of us.
Yeah, let's talk about those sources.
We're integrating massive cohort analyses published in the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal, and the Lancet between 2024 and 2026. These are the gold standards of medical publishing.
And we are moving far beyond just medical journals, too. We are cross-referencing the human health data with environmental toxicology reports from the University of North Carolina and the ATSDR. For those unfamiliar, the ATSDR is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry.
Right.
And perhaps most revealingly, we are going to dig into the Explosive Government Accountability Office, or GAO, reports from 2026 that detail the actual mechanics of regulatory oversight, or, well, the lack thereof.
Exactly. And the central realization that emerges when you overlay all these disparate reports, the true so what of this entire investigation, is that this isn't merely a conversation about what you happen to eat on a Tuesday or what packaging you happen to touch at a drive-thru.
Right.
It is about a closed-loop system. We are looking at an environment designed entirely for sustained economic performance, which achieves that performance at the direct measurable expense of human biology.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to build this from the ground up so you can see the matrix around you. And to you listening, I want you to actively picture your own life as we go through this material.
Yeah. Think about your routines.
Picture your morning commute, your chaotic grocery runs, your late-night snacks when you're just exhausted. To truly understand this system, we have to look at the raw inputs and the biological outputs. We have to look at the full ledger of a week consumed.
The full ledger. I like that.
And the foundation of this entire architecture sits at the convergence of two distinct things: ultra-processed foods and persistent chemical exposure.
Let's focus on the food side first, because the very definition of food in the modern era has undergone a fundamental shift that most people just haven't fully internalized yet.
Yeah, food isn't just food anymore.
Exactly. When we analyze the data from the BMJ and the Lancet spanning 2024 to 2026, we are looking at the culmination of years of tracking hundreds of thousands of people across massive populations.
It's a huge data set.
Huge. And what the data reveals is stark and undeniable. When a population's diet comprises 50% or more of ultra-processed foods, often abbreviated as UPFs, we see a consistent dose-dependent link to increased all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and severe metabolic disorders.
Okay, I want to stop right there and put a pin in that phrase, dose-dependent, because I hear that term thrown around in pharmacology, like with a prescription medication.
Right, like an aspirin.
Yeah, I take 2 pills, I get twice the effect. I don't usually hear it applied to dinner. What does that actually mean in the context of this dietary study?
It is the holy grail of epidemiological research, really. In population studies, it is notoriously difficult to prove that thing A directly causes thing B. You usually only find correlations.
Like people who eat a lot of fast food might also exercise less.
Exactly. Or they sleep less or have higher stress. So what is actually causing the health decline? A dose-dependent relationship cuts through all that noise.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It means that for every incremental increase in the exposure, in this case, for every extra percentage point of ultra-processed food making up a person's diet, there is a corresponding, measurable increase in the negative health outcome.
So it proves it's not just a coincidence of a sedentary lifestyle. The food itself is the active driving agent of the damage.
Precisely. The researchers control for lifestyle factors like smoking, socioeconomic status, and physical activity. Even when all those variables are equalized, the dose-dependent curve remains.
It's terrifying.
It means the UPFs are the independent variable driving the decline in health metrics.
Yeah.
And it's vital to clarify what we actually mean by ultra-processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't talking about junk food, a term I actually dislike, because it implies a sort of harmless, nostalgic, occasional indulgence.
Right, like cotton candy at a state fair. You know it's garbage, you eat it once a year, you move on.
Yes. Or a homemade cookie. A homemade cookie has sugar and butter, but it is not a UPF.
Wait, really? A cookie isn't a UPF?
Homemade one, no. The researchers in these Lancet and BMJ studies emphasize that UPFs are engineered systems. They utilize a classification framework called the NOVA system, which categorizes food not by nutrients, but by the extent and purpose of industrial processing.
Okay, so it's about the manufacturing, not the calorie count.
Exactly.
Yeah.
UPFs are meticulously optimized formulations. They're constructed in laboratories using exact ratios of refined carbohydrates, industrial seed oils, isolated fats, extracted proteins, and highly specific artificial flavor enhancers.
It sounds more like manufacturing a car part than growing a crop. They're essentially reverse engineering human cravings, right?
That is a very accurate way to frame it. They are designed to achieve a specific sensory outcome, hyperpalatability, that deliberately bypasses your natural biological satiety mechanisms. It is food as technology rather than food as agriculture.
But the wild thing about these sources is that this engineered food is only half of the foundation. It's just the payload.
Right.
The other half is the delivery mechanism, the chemical layer.
Yeah.
And this is where we bring in PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, universally known as forever chemicals.
The packaging layer.
Yeah. Now, if you are listening to this, you have almost certainly seen a scary headline or two about PFAS over the last few years. But, as we mentioned at the top, the NENS biomonitoring data puts it into a terrifying new perspective. 98 to 99% of the public has it in their blood.
Let that settle for a moment. In epidemiological terms, 99% isn't considered an exposure event.
What do you mean?
Well, an exposure event is a chemical spill in a specific town affecting a specific demographic. Right. 99% is a universal condition. We are all swimming in it.
Wow. Okay.
The critical link here, provided by the incredibly detailed environmental toxicology reports from UNC and the ATSDR, is the migration pathway. How exactly are these industrial chemicals getting from a factory into our circulatory system? And the answer is inextricably tied to the ultra-processed foods we were just discussing.
Because those hyperpalatable, highly profitable engineered foods need a highly efficient way to be transported, stored, and sold. They need to be wrapped.
They demand a very specific type of packaging. Think about the physical properties of a UPF. They are often high in industrial fats, highly processed oils, and refined starches. If you put a fast food burger or a warm pastry or a serving of heavily seasoned fries into a standard untreated paper bag, what happens?
Oh, the bag turns translucent in about 30 seconds. It gets soaked in grease and falls apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To prevent that, the industry relies on PFAS, the grease-resistant wrappers on your fast food sandwich, the coated cardboard of your salad bowl from that trendy fast casual place, the inner lining of a microwave popcorn bag. These materials are heavily treated with perfluoroalkyl compounds.
So it's basically an invisible shield on the paper.
Yes, the unique chemical structure of PFAS, specifically the carbon-fluorine bond, which is one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry, creates an incredibly effective barrier against both water and oil.
Okay, so it makes a great wrapper. But the wrapper isn't supposed to be part of the meal. How does it jump from the cardboard into the burger?
That is where the UNC toxicology reports provide the smoking gun. The migration isn't a passive process. It is catalyzed by the food itself.
Wait, the food pulls the chemical out?
Yes. The heat of the freshly prepared food, combined with the lipid content, the fat acts as a highly effective solvent. The hot fat literally leaches the forever chemicals out of the packaging coating and draws them directly into the consumable product.
Wow. So I'm sitting in my car eating a burger out of a seemingly harmless paper wrapper. And I'm not just eating the engineered calories. I am actively consuming the chemical technology that makes the convenience of that wrapper possible.
That's exactly what's happening.
And once it's in me, it stays. The ATSDR toxicological profiles explain exactly why they earned the nickname Forever Chemicals.
The forever moniker is not an exaggeration. Because that carbon-fluorine bond is so unnaturally strong, the human body does not possess the enzymes required to break it down. There is no biological mechanism to metabolize PFAS.
It just hits a wall.
Yeah. The toxicological profiles establish that common PFAS variants have a biological half-life in the human body of anywhere from 3 to 8 years.
I need to make sure we underline that. 3 to 8 years is just the half-life. That means if I ate a heavily contaminated takeout meal today, and then I went to live on a remote mountain and somehow never encountered a single forever chemical again, half of that specific chemical load would still be circulating in my bloodstream in the year 2030, maybe 2034.
And practically speaking, you aren't moving to a mountain. You will encounter them again tomorrow. Most people encounter them multiple times a single day in their coffee cups, their lunch wrappers, their dinner containers.
Right.
Because the rate of daily ingestion drastically outpaces the 3 to 8 year clearance rate, they do not clear. They bioaccumulate, they build up in your blood serum, they lodge in the tissues of your liver, and they concentrate in the kidneys.
And the body obviously doesn't just ignore synthetic chemicals building up in major organs.
Mhm.
The biological fallout is extensively documented in these 2026 reports. We are looking at a cascading list of failures.
Severe failures.
Yeah, severe immune suppression, a documented, measurable reduction in the body's ability to create antibodies in response to vaccines, profound lipid and thyroid dysregulation, and significantly elevated risks of specific cancers, primarily kidney and testicular cancers.
What becomes truly fascinating and deeply alarming when analyzing this ledger is how these two distinct inputs interact. What's fascinating here is that we aren't merely looking at two isolated negative variables happening simultaneously. The UPFs and the PFAS are engaging in a devastating biological synergy.
Synergy, that's a corporate word for a biological nightmare.
Yes, the inputs are compounding.
Walk me through that synergy. How do the food and the wrapper actually team up to cause damage?
On one side of the ledger, you have the ultra-processed foods. The BMJ data clearly demonstrates that high UPF diets are a primary driver of systemic chronic inflammation. The human body recognizes these highly refined, nutrient-void, artificial formulations as a foreign stressor.
Like an invader.
Exactly. The gut microbiome is disrupted, the intestinal lining becomes permeable, and the immune system ramps up a massive inflammatory response to deal with the perceived threat.
Okay, so the food effectively sets the house on fire, biologically speaking. The alarms are blaring. The immune system is rushing to put it out.
Yes. But then, on the other side of the ledger, you have the persistent chemical exposure from the PFAS in the packaging that delivered the food. And what do we just identify as one of the primary biological consequences of PFAS accumulation?
Immune suppression.
Exactly. So the ultra-processed food creates an ongoing state of systemic inflammation that urgently requires a robust, high-functioning immune response to manage. Meanwhile, the chemical packaging that brought you the food is simultaneously degrading and suppressing the immune system's baseline capacity to deal with that exact inflammation.
It's an absolutely brutal trap. It's like we are trying to run a highly complex machine on heavily contaminated synthetic fuel. The fuel requires the engine to work twice as hard just to process it. The fuel is also actively dissolving the engine block at the exact same time.
That's a perfect analogy.
You're demanding maximum performance while destroying the capacity for performance.
It is a perfect biological double bind. And the weight of this data gets infinitely heavier when we integrate the emerging epigenetic research from 2025 and 2026. This compounding burden of inflammation and toxic accumulation doesn't just affect the individual consuming the drive-through meal.
Right, epigenetics. For someone who might only vaguely remember that term from a high school biology class, can we break down how that works in this context?
Of course. Epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and your physical environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. It does not alter your underlying base DNA sequence. Instead, it changes the expression of those genes.
So the DNA is the same, but it behaves differently.
Yes. Think of your DNA as a massive soundboard in a recording studio. Epigenetics doesn't change the hardware of the board, but it physically moves the sliders. It turns certain genes on or off, or dials their volume up or down.
Okay, I follow that. So how does the UPF and PFAS loop move the sliders?
Chronic exposure to this dual inflammatory and toxic loop causes abnormal DNA methylation. It actively alters the gene expression related specifically to metabolic regulation and endocrine or hormonal pathways. The body attempts to adapt to this constant toxic and inflammatory stress at a cellular level.
Okay.
But the most chilling discovery in the recent sources is that these epigenetic markers, these new slider positions, are inheritable. They are passed down through the germline to the next generation.
Wait, so the metabolic disadvantage that I create in my own body by eating this stuff, my kids can inherit that altered metabolic baseline.
The data strongly suggests exactly that. The predisposition toward insulin resistance, the altered hormonal baseline, the heightened inflammatory response. It is passed down across generations.
Whoa.
The metabolic disadvantage created by this heavily engineered system isn't strictly an individual problem. It becomes a generational compounding debt. You are inheriting the biological toll of your parents' convenience and passing it on to your descendants.
The ledger isn't just a week consumed, it's a lineage consumed. We are passing down the biological debt of our entire food infrastructure.
Yes, unfortunately.
But this brings up a massive, glaring question. If this fuel is so degrading to our engines, if it causes this much systemic chaos and we physically feel worse when we eat it, why do we keep craving it? Why is it so incredibly difficult to just logically decide to walk past that vending machine or drive past the brightly lit drive-through on the way home?
That question transitions us perfectly into our second phase of analysis. To understand the craving, we have to look at how these exact same inputs fundamentally hack our biological hardware. We need to explore the concept of rewired satiety.
Because my conscious brain knows the donut is bad, but my body screams for it anyway. Let's talk about the hack.
To comprehend the hack, we first must understand the original programming. The human body does not operate on guesswork. It communicates its nutritional needs through highly evolved, incredibly precise signaling systems. Feelings like hunger, fullness, baseline energy, and fatigue. These aren't just vague psychological moods. They are complex neurochemical and hormonal feedback loops designed over hundreds of thousands of years to maintain metabolic homeostasis or balance.
Your body has an intricate dashboard. It has fuel gauges, warning lights, and automated climate control.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
When your stomach is empty, it secretes a highly specific hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin travels through the bloodstream, crosses into the brain, and hits receptors in the hypothalamus that say, we are at an energy deficit. We need to acquire calories.
Makes sense.
Conversely, when you eat and your fat cells begin to absorb and store energy, those fat cells secrete a different hormone called leptin. Leptin travels back to the brain and says, our energy stores are replenished. We have enough fuel. Cease eating behaviors.
It's an elegant, beautifully self-regulating system. My stomach literally texts my brain to say it's empty, and my fat cells text my brain to say we're full. It kept our species alive through ice ages and famines.
And it functioned perfectly well until we introduced the modern ultra-processed hack. UPFs completely short-circuit this deeply ingrained system. The mechanics of it are fascinating. Because UPFs are essentially pre-digested, they've been entirely stripped of their natural fiber matrix and complex cellular structures during the manufacturing process. They hit the digestive tract and the bloodstream with unnatural, violent speed.
They don't need to be broken down, they just flood the gates.
They deliver a massive, immediate glycemic load. Your blood glucose spikes far beyond natural parameters. Your pancreas recognizes this toxic level of circulating sugar as an acute emergency and dumps a massive compensatory wave of insulin into the blood to clear the glucose out and force it into your cells.
Which inevitably leads to the crash. We've all felt that mid-afternoon slump after a heavy, refined carb lunch.
The crash is physiological. The overcorrection of insulin drives your blood sugar so low that it triggers an immediate emergency hunger signal, a massive release of ghrelin, regardless of the fact that you just consumed 1,000 calories an hour prior. This artificially manufactured spike and crash disrupts the entire insulin response system and locks the individual into a cycle of constant, urgent craving.
But the hack goes deeper than just riding a blood sugar roller coaster.
See?
The sources talk extensively about the brain's reward centers.
The neurological hack is arguably more powerful than the metabolic one. The specific, lab-engineered combinations of exact salt ratios, refined sugars, industrial fats, and artificial flavorings in UPFs are designed to trigger dopaminergic pathways in the brain. They prompt a release of dopamine with an intensity that mirrors the pharmacological profile of addictive drugs.
It's essentially hitting the exact same neurological buttons as pulling the lever on a slot machine or taking a narcotic.
From a neurochemical perspective, yes. The dopamine response is so overwhelming and so intensely rewarding to the primitive survival centers of the brain that it begins to drive consumption completely independent of actual caloric need.
So hunger isn't even part of the equation anymore.
Exactly. You are no longer eating because your physical dashboard says your fuel is low. You are eating because your brain is aggressively demanding the dopamine hit that the engineered formulation reliably promises.
Okay, but what happens to leptin in all this? The hormone from the fat cells that is supposed to be screaming, hey, we have plenty of energy stored, stop eating. Why doesn't that override the dopamine?
Because under chronic, relentless exposure to this UPF cycle, the leptin signal gets drowned out. The resulting systemic inflammation we discussed earlier actually blocks leptin from binding to its receptors in the brain. The body develops what endocrinologists call leptin resistance.
So the signal is sent but not received.
The fat cells are still frantically producing the hormone, screaming that the body is full, but the brain literally becomes deaf to the signal. The physical dashboard gauge for fullness is permanently pegged to empty. An individual can consume thousands of excess calories, and their brain genuinely neurologically believes the body is starving.
Which is absolutely terrifying on its own. The food itself breaks the body's ability to know when to stop eating the food. But this is the deep dive, which means we have to layer the complexities back in. How does the chemical layer, the PFAS, interact with this broken dashboard?
This is where the ATSDR data provides the crucial missing link. PFAS compounds are profound endocrine disruptors. The endocrine system is your body's entire hormonal communication network, the very system managing the ghrelin, insulin, and leptin we just discussed. One of the primary documented targets of PFAS toxicity is the thyroid gland.
And the thyroid is basically the master control switch for metabolism, right?
It regulates your basal metabolic rate, how efficiently your cells utilize energy. PFAS compounds have a structural similarity to certain hormones, allowing them to bind to thyroid receptors and block the actual hormones from doing their job. By actively interfering with thyroid function and lipid processing in the liver, PFAS compounds are throwing literal sand into the exact same delicate regulatory gears that the UPFs are already stripping.
Let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. The engineered food breaks the fullness signal and spikes the dopamine, causing massive overconsumption. And the chemical packaging the food came in degrades the thyroid and the metabolism's actual ability to process that overconsumption.
You have mapped it perfectly. And we can see the behavioral results of this dual mechanism vividly in the neuroimaging and tightly controlled feeding studies published in 2025. Researchers placed individuals accustomed to high UPF diets into functional MRI machines and simply showed them images of hyperpalatable foods.
Just pictures.
Just pictures.
Yeah.
The reward centers in their brains lit up far more intensely and with different neural routing than individuals accustomed to whole food diets.
The brain is physically wired differently based on the diet.
Furthermore, in inpatient feeding studies where researchers tightly control every variable, they demonstrated something profound. When people are locked in a facility and given unrestricted access to ultra-processed foods, they will spontaneously, unconsciously consume upwards of 500 extra calories a day, compared to when they are given unrestricted access to unprocessed foods.
And wait, let me guess. The macronutrients were different.
That's the critical detail. The researchers matched the macronutrients perfectly. The UPF diet and the whole food diet had the exact same amounts of carbs, fats, proteins, and even fiber.
Wait, really? The nutritional profile was mathematically identical, but the people eating the processed form of those nutrients still massively overate.
Because it is the form of the food, the engineered delivery system that bypasses conscious participation. This is the most critical insight for the listener to absorb. This entire complex process, the violent glucose spikes, the dopamine surges, the acquired leptin resistance, the subtle endocrine disruption from the wrappers, it all operates entirely below the level of your conscious awareness.
You don't feel it happening.
You do not feel your leptin receptors downregulating in the hypothalamus. You do not feel your thyroid struggling against a fluorine bond. You just feel hungry again.
Which brings up a really uncomfortable, almost existential question. If our internal guidance systems, our foundational evolutionary biological signals for survival, are essentially being jammed, hacked, and overwritten by these chemicals and foods, can we even call our eating habits a choice anymore? Or is it purely a conditioned response to a synthetic environment?
From a strict neurological and endocrinological standpoint, the line between free choice and conditioned response becomes extremely blurred. The modern environment is providing a pervasive engineered stimulus that predictably and reliably forces a specific, unavoidable biological response.
Right.
The higher executive functions of the prefrontal cortex, the parts of you that make rational, long-term choices, are actively being overridden by the older, deeper, survival-driven parts of the brain that are screaming for the dopamine and quick energy the environment has trained them to expect.
It's like trying to logically, intellectually decide not to blink when someone throws a handful of sand directly into your eyes. You can tell yourself not to blink all you want, but your biology takes over and forces the reaction. And if we want to see this conditioned response in its absolute rawest, most undeniable form, we need to look at the environments where choices are the most artificially restricted. We need to look at what the 2026 occupational studies call night shift biology.
This is a crucial transition. This is where the theoretical architecture we've been discussing becomes a very harsh physical reality. We have to look at the extreme working edge of the economy. We must examine the midnight supply chain.
I want you, the listener, to picture this scene vividly. It's 4:00 a.m. You are driving down a massive empty interstate. The only lights are the harsh fluorescent glow of a sprawling truck stop on the horizon or the humming sodium lamps over a 1,000,000-square-foot logistics warehouse.
It's a very specific environment.
It is. Inside those massive concrete spaces, people are wide awake. Long-haul drivers, warehouse pickers, stockers, logistics managers. These are the people literally keeping the physical grid of our modern lives moving. They ensure the shelves are stocked and the packages arrive. But at 4 a.m., what are their actual options for sustenance?
In that environment, at that hour, their options are entirely dictated by the closed-loop system we just described. If a logistics worker in a sprawling distribution center gets a mandatory 15-minute break at 3:30 in the morning, they cannot access a fresh, biologically appropriate whole food meal. It is geographically and temporally impossible.
Right, nothing is open except the break room,
Their physical environment restricts them entirely to the perimeter of their worksite.
which means vending machines and convenience stores.
Precisely. They are relegated to packaged foods with months-long shelf lives, heated display cases rolling hot dogs that have been there for hours, and energy drinks. They are entirely surrounded by the exact engineered formulations, the highest possible concentrations of UPFs and PFAS that we know dismantle metabolic health.
And we aren't just guessing about the health impacts here. We have specific occupational health data on this exact demographic, right?
The 2026 occupational health data focused on night shift and logistics workers is deeply alarming. When compared to the general population, this specific cohort shows massively elevated rates of clinical insulin resistance, severe obesity, profound cardiovascular strain, and generalized immune suppression.
That's a heavy toll.
While the restricted, highly processed diet is obviously a major factor, the researchers point out that it is the compounding variables of the environment that make it so exceptionally destructive.
You're talking about the circadian disruption, the double hit.
Yes, the biological bubble hit.
Yeah.
Human biology is intimately genetically tied to the cycle of the sun. Our metabolism, our cellular insulin sensitivity, our digestive enzyme production, they all operate on a strict circadian rhythm dictated by light and dark.
So the body expects to process food at 1 p.m., not 3 a.m.
Exactly. When a worker consumes a heavy, hyperpalatable, massive glycemic load meal at 3 a.m., a time when the body is hormonally flooded with melatonin and expecting to be asleep and fasting, it causes massive metabolic instability.
The body is basically saying, what are you doing? We're closed.
The liver and the pancreas are essentially caught completely off guard. They're not primed to secrete the necessary enzymes or manage the Q10 spike. Consequently, the inflammatory damage of the UPFs is exponentially amplified by the circadian mismatch.
And the chemical load, the forever chemicals, must be ever present in that setting. Because in a 4:00 a.m. logistic environment, everything, literally every single caloric option available is packaged for maximum indestructible shelf life.
Packaging is the foundational, non-negotiable requirement for food in any logistics or transit environment. The food has to survive in a break room vending machine for 6 weeks or bounce around in a truck cabin across 3 time zones. Therefore, the reliance on PFAS-treated wrappers, rigid plastics, and moisture-resistant coatings is absolute.
It's unavoidable.
These workers are receiving a dose of persistent chemical exposure straight into their bloodstream with every single meal they are forced to consume on shift.
It's an incredibly tragic irony when you step back and look at it. These workers, the logistics drivers, the warehouse staff, the night shift nurses, they are the literal physical engine of our entire consumer economy. They keep the massive gears turning. They keep the grocery shelves stocked for the rest of us. They make the convenience of modern life possible.
They do.
But they are being systematically forced to run their own biological engines on the exact cheap, contaminated fuel we just established is destroying the hardware. They are trading their biological resilience, their long-term cellular health, just to keep the supply chain moving.
It is a stark reality, and it highlights the broader context we must acknowledge. The human body is fundamentally, evolutionarily not designed for a nocturnal, high-stress, UPF-fueled schedule. But the system is meticulously designed for it.
The economic system.
Yes. The economic system demands continuous, uninterrupted physical output. In these 4.00 AM environments, food is not selected by the individual based on preference, culture, or nutritional value. It is simply accepted based on proximity and necessity. It is merely raw fuel required to maintain the output of labor.
Wow.
The transaction is completely quiet, almost invisible. The goods move to their destination, the clock advances, and the health of the worker shifts incrementally downwards, entirely unnoticed by the broader society that benefits from their labor.
Okay, so it's easy as a listener to hear about the night shift worker or the long-haul trucker and think, well, that's terrible, but that's an extreme case. That's a unique occupational hazard that doesn't really apply to my life in the suburbs. But according to these sources, that is the ultimate trap.
It is.
Because the exact same architecture that surrounds the trucker at 4 AM scales up flawlessly to surround everyone during their normal 9-to-5 life. We are all living inside a softer, better-lit version of this exact same construct. Let's talk about the dependency grid and what the researchers term the illusion of freedom.
To truly conceptualize the grid that surrounds us, we have to introduce a sociological concept that dietary researchers are increasingly using to describe modern food environments. They call it constraint disguised as abundance.
Constraint disguised as abundance. I absolutely love that phrasing, even though the reality of it is terrifying. It sounds like a magic trick.
It perfectly captures the psychological sleight of hand of the modern food system. If we look at the massive global dietary studies published across 2025 and 2026, the data shows an astonishing reality. Ultra-processed foods now account for over more than 50% of the total daily caloric intake across almost all industrialized regions.
Over half.
Yes, in some demographics, it pushes closer to 60 or 70%. More than half of the sheer energy keeping modern civilization moving comes from engineered formulations.
And obviously that is not an accident. We didn't just stumble into a reality where half our food is made in a lab.
It is the result of optimization. UPFs possess specific operational advantages that make them the perfect foundational block for a global economy. First, they have incredible, almost indefinite shelf life, which entirely eliminates the massive financial risk of spoilage for massive corporations.
No rotten food means no lost money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, they have a staggeringly low cost of production, relying entirely on heavily subsidized, mass-produced commodity crops like monoculture corn, soy, and wheat. And third, they offer immediate frictionless accessibility to the consumer. No prep, no cooking, just immediate calories. But these exact economic advantages are what create the unseen constraint.
Right. Because real food spoils. Real food is expensive to transport. Real food requires the consumer to have the time and energy to prepare it. And you add the ambient PFAS exposure to this grid. We mentioned the 98 to 99% saturation in the blood. That proves that this exposure doesn't require you to actively opt in. You don't have to consciously choose to consume forever chemicals for them to end up in your liver.
It does not require individual compliance, and it cannot be defeated by individual vigilance. It is built into the physical infrastructure itself. It is in the municipal water supply. It is in the dust settling in your home from treated textiles. And inescapably, it is in the packaging of the food that surrounds you at all times.
So if we take a step back and attempt to map the physical geography of this grid, what does it actually look like to the average person?
It looks exactly like our everyday lives.
Yeah.
Is the highway truck stops we talked about? Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also the corner gas stations you hit on the way to work. It's the massive distribution centers. It's the brightly lit corporate cafeterias and white-collar Class A office buildings. It's the checkout aisles at pharmacies, bookstores, and hardware stores. Every single point of friction in our day is padded with these inputs.
And while each of those locations presents a distinct variation in aesthetic branding, different corporate logos, different marketing campaigns, different packaging colors designed to appeal to different demographics structurally, beneath the surface, the nutritional profile is entirely identical. It is all the exact same base formulation of refined starches, industrial seed oils, high fructose sugars, and sodium, wrapped in the exact same PFAS-coated materials.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me conceptually. Think about your own experience as a consumer. You walk into a massive modern grocery store, right?
Yeah.
The doors slide open, the AC hits you, and you are standing at the end of a center aisle that is 50 yards long. The shelves from floor to ceiling are packed with literally thousands of brightly colored boxes, bags, and cans. Psychologically, you feel like an emperor of food. You feel like you have infinite choices. The sheer volume of options is overwhelming.
It really is.
But if you strip away the branding, if you ignore the mascots and the bold claims of fortified with vitamins, and you look strictly at the ingredient lists and the chemical makeup of the packaging, 90% of that massive aisle is the exact same structural design. So the question remains, are you actually making a choice? Or are you just picking your preferred flavor of the same underlying dependency?
It is a powerful framing. If we connect this to the bigger picture, to the macroeconomic scale, we see that this illusion of choice produces a very specific, highly desirable functional outcome for the system. The grid is meticulously designed for sustained, uninterrupted participation. The system doesn't immediately kill the host. That would be counterproductive. That would be bad for the economy.
Exactly.
Instead, individuals degrade slowly over decades. They degrade metabolically, their immune function drops, their cardiovascular risk steadily rises, their joints ache from inflammation. But it happens at a precisely calibrated pace that doesn't immediately stop them from waking up, clocking in, working, and consuming.
They stay just functional enough to keep the grid humming. They are sick, but they aren't hospitalized.
Exactly. And in a truly vicious cycle, the biological degradation itself actually drives more reliance on the grid. As the metabolic damage from the UPFs compounds, chronic fatigue increases. As the demands of modern work and life remain constant, time scarcity increases. People have less energy and less time. And what do severe fatigue and time scarcity demand above all else?
They demand convenience.
Right. If I'm exhausted after a 10-hour shift, I am not chopping vegetables. I'm hitting a drive-thru or microwaving a box.
Yes. The fatigue demands the immediate, frictionless, dopamine-spiking calories of the engineered inputs. The physical exhaustion caused by participating in the system actively forces you to rely more heavily on the exact dietary inputs that are causing the exhaustion in the first place. It is a perfectly closed, self-sustaining loop.
Okay, but this brings me to a point of intense frustration, and I'm sure anyone listening is feeling it too. If the loop is this obvious to the researchers, if the data from the BMJ, the Lancet, the UNC toxicology departments, and the ATSDR is this clear and undeniable, if independent scientists can clearly see this cycle of biological attrition playing out across the population, why hasn't someone pulled a giant systemic fire alarm?
That's the logical next question.
Why haven't the health authorities or the government stepped in to break the loop and protect the public? That glaring question leads us to the final piece of the architecture, the final firewall. Regulatory capture.
This is perhaps the most crucial and sobering piece of the puzzle to understand, because it explains the mechanics of how a system this demonstrably detrimental to public health is allowed to persist indefinitely. And I want to be very clear and methodical here. We're looking exclusively at the 2026 Government Accountability Office reports and documented congressional oversight findings. We are simply unpacking the structural mechanisms exactly as they are documented impartially in the federal data. We aren't theorizing, and we aren't taking a partisan political stance. We are analyzing the dry, bureaucratic mechanics of oversight.
Right, I'm glad you clarified that. We are just reading the blueprints of the firewall that are public record. So to understand the blueprints, we have to understand the foundation. What is the GRS framework? Because reading through the sources, GRS seems to be the linchpin that allows the whole food side of this system to operate.
GRAS is an acronym that stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. It is a specific regulatory framework in the United States governing the introduction of food additives. To understand the loophole, you have to understand the history. Originally, when the Food Additives Amendment was passed decades ago in 1958, the GRAS designation was meant as a common-sense measure for extremely common historical ingredients.
Like what?
It was meant for things like vinegar, baking soda, black pepper, or basic vegetable oils. Substances that everyone logically knew were safe because humans had been eating them for centuries without dropping dead. The government didn't want to waste resources rigorously testing salt.
Makes total sense. You don't need a multi-million-dollar clinical trial to prove that vinegar is okay to put on a salad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But over the ensuing decades, fueled by massive industry lobbying and creative legal interpretations, that common sense exemption morphed into a massive systemic loophole. The GRAS framework currently allows for self-certification by the massive food and chemical conglomerates.
Wait, pause. Self-certification. That sounds like a contradiction in terms when we were talking about public health. How does that practically work?
It works exactly as it sounds. Let's say a massive conglomerate develops a novel, fully synthetic chemical additive in a lab, maybe a new artificial preservative that extends shelf life by 2 years, or a new flavor enhancer that triggers massive dopamine release.
Hmm.
Under the current interpretation of GRAS, that company can simply convene its own internal panel of scientists they are paying to conduct an internal safety review.
Oh, wow.
If their own panel declares the novel substance generally recognized as safe, the company can introduce it directly into the public food supply. They are not legally required to obtain independent pre-approval or conduct long-term testing via a regulatory agency like the FDA. In many cases, they aren't even required to notify the FDA that the chemical exists.
That is mind-blowing. So essentially, the watchdogs aren't asleep at the gate. The gate itself was designed, built, and is currently operated by the people driving the massive trucks full of chemicals through it.
That is a very apt analogy. The industry acts as its own gatekeeper. And we see the exact same historical trajectory with the chemical layer, with PFAS compounds. For decades, the chemical industry aggressively expanded the use of PFAS across thousands of consumer applications. Food packaging, stain-resistant textiles, firefighting foams, cosmetics, and industrial coatings.
So putting it everywhere.
Everywhere. These incredibly complex, indestructible chemicals were introduced rapidly at a massive scale with minimal independent oversight or environmental impact studies.
And no one knew because they weren't forced to disclose the long-term biological effects.
Exactly. It wasn't until widespread, completely independent biomonitoring programs like the early iterations of the NAE surveys finally caught up and revealed the staggering, universal levels of human exposure that the regulatory bodies were forced to begin reacting. The exposure preceded the regulation by decades.
But even now that the exposure is known, now that we have the 2026 GAO reports explicitly detailing the damage, according to those very same reports, the regulatory reaction is essentially performative. Let's break down what the GAO actually found when they audited this oversight system.
The GAO reports from 2026 highlight a profoundly fractured and ineffective system, though using the word ineffective might imply that it's an accident. The federal audits document a staggering lack of basic data. They cite incomplete tracking of chemical usage across industries, meaning the government literally does not know how much of these chemicals are being produced or where they are going.
That's terrifying.
They highlight severely limited mandatory testing requirements for entirely new compounds before they hit the market.
It's essentially a policy of produce now, discover the consequences later.
Yes. The audits also point out a highly fragmented, siloed system of interagency coordination. The EPA might have one piece of data, the FDA might have another, and the CDC might have a third, but they lack the structural framework to share that data effectively and build a comprehensive risk model.
So the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Exactly. And most critically, the GAO highlights the incredibly slow, labyrinthine bureaucratic response timelines whenever emerging independent data does finally prove harm.
And the congressional oversight hearings from 2026 backed this up with a paper trail, didn't they? They subpoenaed documents and uncovered internal communications.
They did. The congressional hearings surfaced thousands of pages of internal communications from within both regulatory bodies and industry lobbying groups. Those documents showed that known documented risks regarding both the inflammatory nature of UPF formulations and the extreme toxicity of persistent chemicals were frequently acknowledged behind closed doors by the people in charge.
They knew about the immune suppression and the epigenetic stuff.
They knew the data, but instead of initiating immediate precautionary intervention to protect the public, action was constantly, methodically deferred, pending further study.
Pending further study. The ultimate undefeated stalling tactic of any bureaucracy.
It is highly effective because it sounds incredibly reasonable. It allows the system to continue operating at maximum profitability while creating the public illusion of responsible scientific caution. And when monitoring programs are eventually put in place to appease public outcry, the GAO notes they are overwhelmingly voluntary.
Voluntary.
They rely on the industry to self-report. This provides a slow trickle of curated data to the public, but it carries zero actual enforcement mechanisms.
Yeah.
Furthermore, when chemical safety thresholds, the legal limits of exposure, are eventually adjusted downward, they're adjusted in tiny, incremental steps that invariably lag years or even decades behind the independent scientific consensus.
This raises a really important philosophical question about how we view our institutions, though, because if you look at this mountain of evidence from the outside as a normal citizen, you might just throw your hands up in despair and say, the government is completely failing us. This is a catastrophic regulatory failure. But the sociologists and researchers in our sources make a very specific, chilling distinction here.
They do, and it is perhaps the most vital distinction of the entire deep dive. The key takeaway from synthesizing the GAO data and the historical timeline of the last 50 years is that what we are witnessing is not regulatory failure. It is regulatory continuity.
Explain the difference between failure and continuity in this context. Why does that word matter so much?
Failure implies an earnest, systemic attempt to stop the harm that simply did not succeed due to incompetence or lack of resources. Continuity, however, means the system is functioning exactly as it was structurally designed to function.
Wait, designed to allow this?
The modern regulatory apparatus, by design, is not built to act as an emergency brake. It's not designed to abruptly halt the flow of commerce or aggressively disrupt the massive multi-trillion-dollar economic engine of the global food and chemical industries.
So what is it designed to do?
It is designed to manage public perception and ensure economic stability. It is designed to act as a shock absorber for public outrage. When a scandal hits or undeniable data is published, the apparatus activates. They announce a new exploratory committee, they commission a multi-year interagency report, they hold a highly publicized congressional hearing where executives are scolded on camera, and all the while, the physical flow of ultra-processed foods and forever chemicals continues uninterrupted into the population.
The gears just keep turning.
The massive gears of the economy keep turning. The system hums along, managing the friction of public health concerns without ever actually reducing its output.
So the firewall isn't protecting us from the dangers of the system. The firewall is protecting the system from the disruptive panic of the public. It prevents sudden, economically disastrous changes to the status quo.
Precisely. The bureaucratic stabilization mechanisms ensure that the engineered consumption and the persistent chemical exposure can continue at a global scale, fundamentally uninterrupted by the compounding, catastrophic biological data we discussed at the very beginning of this hour.
Wow. Okay, let's step back and look at the entire map we've drawn over the course of this deep dive. We've traced the entire hidden architecture from the laboratory to the liver and all the way to Capitol Hill. We map the raw inputs, the hyper-palatable, ultra-processed foods that make up over half our calories, and the universal accumulation of forever chemicals in our blood.
We looked closely at the biological hack, too. How these specific inputs hijack our hormones, aggressively spike our dopamine, and silence our natural evolutionary signals of satiety.
We also mapped the physical manifestation of this grid, the ambient, unavoidable exposure, and the illusion of choice that surrounds us in every grocery store, convenience store, and corporate cafeteria. And finally, we just examined the regulatory firewall that guarantees this self-sustaining cycle remains unbroken and profitable.
It is a complete, perfectly closed loop. Engineered consumption inevitably leads to persistent chemical exposure. That chemical exposure, compounding with the inflammatory food, leads to profound biological and metabolic disruption.
And the regulatory bodies provide the necessary maintenance, cover, and delay, ensuring the massive economic system isn't halted by the health fallout. And the crushing economic demands of modern life, the exhaustion, the occupational realities of the 4.0 a.m. logistics worker and the 9-to-5 office drone alike reinforce our desperate reliance on the cheap, convenient inputs of the system.
It is deeply unsettling, primarily because it doesn't require a comic book villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom.
Yeah.
The system doesn't need to force anyone at gunpoint to participate. It embeds itself seamlessly within absolute biological necessity. We all fundamentally have to eat to survive, and to eat, in a modern industrialized world, is to implicitly participate in this grid.
And that is the ultimate, inescapable leverage the system has over us. It operates through the unavoidable mechanics of human survival.
Yes, it weaponizes our basic biological needs against our long-term biological health.
So what does this all mean for us, the people actually living inside this grid? We started this deep dive talking about our human desire for visibility, about wanting to clearly see the cause and effect of our problems, like seeing a dented bumper after a car crash or a broken bone on an X-ray. Today, we've essentially taken a massive high-resolution X-ray of our modern consumer environment.
And the results of that scan are pretty clear.
Yeah, what we found in that scan is that the choices we firmly believe we are making every single day, what to have for a quick lunch, what snacks to feed our kids after school, what brand to pick off the shelf, are heavily, heavily curated to sustain this massive economic machine, even as those exact choices slowly, quietly dismantle our cellular health.
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting realization. The autonomy we fiercely believe we have as we push our carts down the checkout aisle is, in many structural ways, an engineered illusion.
Which brings us to a final thought for today. We want to leave you with something to really turn over in your mind the next time you find yourself standing under those bright fluorescent lights at the grocery store, staring down that 50-yard wall of brightly colored boxes and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of options. If the very act required for your day-to-day survival, the simple, inescapable, necessary act of eating carries within it the steady, compounding, invisible dismantling of your own biology, at what point does your free agency stop being actively exercised and start simply being simulated?